Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the United States. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The town of Millbrook in Dutchess County, New York, was considered unremarkable by most standards in the early 1900s. Nestled within the rolling hills of the Hudson Valley, approximately 85 miles north of New York City, it was a place where everyone knew their neighbors, where church bells rang on Sundays, and where death, like everywhere else, was an occasional visitor. The population in 1915 numbered just under 2,000 souls, most engaged in agriculture, local commerce, or commuting via the recently established Dutchess County Railroad to larger employment centers in Poughkeepsie or Point South. The town featured a central square with a prominent clock tower erected in 1891 to commemorate the founding of the village. Around this square clustered the essential buildings of small-town American life: the First National Bank of Millbrook, St. Joseph's Catholic Church, the town hall, and various shops catering to local needs. 2 blocks east of the square, on Franklin Avenue, stood the Hammond Funeral Home, a dignified Victorian structure with forest green shutters and a modest sign displaying the family name. For generations, the Hammond family had served the community in their time of grief, preparing the deceased for their final rest with what was believed to be the utmost care and respect. The funeral business in early 20th century America was undergoing significant transformation. The ancient practice of families washing and preparing their own dead had largely given way to professional undertakers, who offered specialized knowledge in preservation techniques and ceremonial arrangements. This transition placed unprecedented trust in individuals who were granted intimate access to the deceased at their most vulnerable, a trust that most undertakers honored with dignity and professionalism. The Hammond family had established their funeral business in Millbrook in 1873, when Jeremiah Hammond, a Boston-trained undertaker, recognized the opportunity presented by the growing community. Jeremiah had learned his trade during the Civil War, where the need to transport fallen soldiers home for burial had advanced embalming techniques and established the profession as essential. Upon his death in 1892, the business passed to his son, George Hammond, who maintained the establishment's reputation for dignity and care. George Hammond was remembered in town records as a somber but kind man who served on the town council and contributed regularly to community initiatives. His own funeral in 1908, attended by over 200 Millbrook residents, was testament to the respect he had earned during his tenure. In 1915, the business was operated by Edward Hammond, a man in his early 40s who had inherited the establishment from his father, George. Unlike his father and grandfather, Edward had not initially embraced the family business. According to local newspaper accounts from the early 1900s, Edward had departed Millbrook after graduating from the local school in 1890. Allegedly to study medicine at a university in Philadelphia. He returned to Millbrook only after his father's health began to decline around 1906, having apparently abandoned his medical studies without completing a degree. This biographical detail would later seem significant to investigators attempting to understand Edward's psychological profile. Edward was described by townspeople as a serious, solitary figure who spoke little but performed his duties with apparent reverence. Standing just under 6 feet tall, with thinning dark hair and a meticulously maintained mustache, he presented the precise, formal appearance expected of his profession. His daily routine rarely varied. He rose early, took breakfast alone at the Millbrook Inn, attended to business at the funeral home, and occasionally walked to the post office or bank in mid-afternoon. Several evenings each week he could be found dining alone at the same corner table at the Millbrook Inn, where he would read the Poughkeepsie Eagle News while consuming a modest meal, accompanied by a single glass of sherry. Edward was neither liked nor disliked. Rather, he existed on the periphery of Millbrook society, respected for the necessary service he provided, but rarely invited into local homes except in a professional capacity. Few noticed his pale complexion or the peculiar intensity in his eyes when he spoke of his work, attributing such characteristics to the nature of his profession. Those who did business with him regularly, the local florist, the printer who produced funeral programs, the groundskeepers at the town's 2 cemeteries, described him as unfailingly precise in his requirements and generous in his payments, Though lacking the warmth that had characterized his father's business relationships, he was exact in everything, recalled Thomas Wright, owner of Wright's Printing on Millbrook Square, in a statement given to police in July 1915. Every program had to be perfect. The right paper, the right typeface, the correct spacing. If you gave him exactly what he asked for, he was pleased and paid promptly, sometimes extra, but he never smiled, never engaged in casual conversation. It was as if the social niceties were a foreign language to him. The Hammond Funeral Home gained a reputation for the remarkable appearance of the deceased at viewings. Mourners often commented that their loved ones looked almost lifelike or peaceful, as if sleeping, attributing this to Edward's skill and dedication. What they couldn't have known was that Edward Hammond's attention to the bodies in his care extended far beyond professional obligation. The funeral home itself stood as a testament to Victorian architecture, with its high ceilings, dark wood paneling, and heavy drapery that seemed to absorb both light and sound. The building had been constructed in 1873, specifically to serve as both a funeral home and residence, a common arrangement for the period. The ground floor contained the business spaces, a formal entry hall with a guest register atop a mahogany pedestal, a consultation room where Hammond met with bereaved families, 2 viewing rooms of different sizes to accommodate various funeral arrangements, and a small chapel used for services when a church funeral was not desired or possible. These public spaces were maintained in immaculate condition, with polished woodwork, carefully selected furnishings, and subdued lighting provided by brass wall sconces and crystal chandeliers. The main viewing room featured ornate chandeliers that cast a soft amber glow over proceedings, while the consultation room, where Hammond met with bereaved families, was furnished with leather chairs and a large mahogany desk. The room contained a glass-fronted cabinet displaying various options for caskets, urns, and memorial cards, all represented by miniature models or samples rather than the actual items, which were stored elsewhere in the building. A large oil painting of Jeremiah Hammond, the founder of the business, hung on the wall behind the desk, his stern countenance surveying all transactions conducted in the room. The second floor contained Edward Hammond's private quarters, a bedroom, a small sitting room, a private bath, and a study where he kept business records and correspondence. These rooms were never seen by clients or casual visitors, and even Grace Miller, a cleaning woman who maintained the public areas of the funeral home, entered them only once weekly to perform basic housekeeping. The third floor, originally designed as servants' quarters, remained largely unused after Edward took over the business, as he employed no live-in staff. The basement of the Hammond Funeral Home, where the preparation work took place, was accessible via a narrow staircase at the rear of the building. Few Millbrook residents had ever ventured into this space, as it was considered private and professional territory. Those who had, deliverymen, repairmen, the occasional apprentice who never seemed to last long, described a clinically clean environment with tiled walls and floors, specialized tables for preparation work, and cabinets filled with the tools of the mortician's trade. The basement extended beneath the entire building, though visitors to the preparation room saw only a portion of this space. The remainder was ostensibly used for storage of caskets, preservation chemicals, and other funeral supplies. What most failed to notice, or at least failed to question, was the unusual amount of space dedicated to storage, cabinets, and closets that seemed excessive for the practical needs of a small-town funeral home. Had anyone examined the building plans filed with the Dutchess County Clerk's office, they might have noticed discrepancies between the original 1873 specifications and the renovations commissioned by Edward Hammond in 1910. These renovations, while described in permit applications as modernizations to accommodate updated preparation techniques, had substantially altered the basement layout, creating spaces not reflected in any official documentation. The first hint that something was amiss came in February 1915, when Mary Collins, a young widow of 26, died suddenly of pneumonia. Mary had been well known in Millbrook, having grown up in the town before marrying John Collins, a promising young lawyer who himself had succumbed to influenza just 2 years earlier. Her death, coming so soon after her husband's, struck the community as particularly tragic. Mary left behind no children, only a sister, Elizabeth Thorpe, who arrived from Albany to make arrangements at the Hammond Funeral Home. Later, Elizabeth would tell investigators that something about Edward Hammond's manner disturbed her deeply during their initial consultation. He spoke of Mary's beauty with an inappropriate familiarity, Elizabeth noted in a statement given to authorities. When I arrived, he had already transferred her body from Dr. Wilson's office to the funeral home, though I had given no authorization for this. He described her as the most perfect subject he had received in months, a phrase that struck me as oddly clinical and yet somehow personal. Elizabeth's statement continued. He asked if I would prefer her to be dressed in her wedding gown, though I had mentioned no such thing. When I inquired how he knew about her wedding dress, he simply said that such garments were commonly used for young women. Later I recalled that Mary had been married in Albany, not Millbrook, and that Mr. Hammond would have had no occasion to see her wedding photographs or dress. This realization came only after everything else came to light. According to parish records at St. Joseph's Catholic Church, Mary Collins's body remained at the funeral home for 3 days before burial, standard practice for the time. The church registry noted that Father Michael Donovan performed the funeral mass on February 12, 1915, with interment following at St. Joseph's Cemetery. The registry described the service as well attended, befitting the deceased's standing in the community, with no mention of anything unusual in the proceedings. What was not standard, though few would know it then, was Edward Hammond's behavior during those 3 nights. The funeral director's logbook, discovered decades later, contained entries that deviated significantly from professional documentation. On the pages dedicated to Mary Collins, Hammond had written what appeared to be personal observations. Subject presents exceptional quality. Skin retains remarkable elasticity. Hair maintains luster uncommon after cessation of life. Features arranged in peaceful repose. The entries continued, becoming increasingly inappropriate as Hammond documented his interactions with the deceased. Visited again at midnight. Applied additional preparations to preserve suppleness. Arranged her according to photograph provided by sister, though my own arrangement was superior. Subject responds well to careful handling. These entries, sealed from public view after the case came to light, suggested a disturbing level of intimacy between Hammond and the bodies in his care. Most disturbing were entries from the final night before Mary Collins's funeral. Final visitation. 3 hours spent in contemplation of subject's perfect form. Took 6 photographs for personal collection. Secured lock of hair with blue ribbon matches her eyes precisely. Reluctant to proceed with final preparations for burial. Some subjects should remain above ground indefinitely. Elizabeth Thorpe later recalled that when she viewed her sister's body before the funeral, she had been struck by how lifelike Mary appeared. Her complexion had a glow that seemed impossible in death, she told investigators. Her lips were colored as if with cosmetics, though I had provided none. Her hair was arranged elaborately with small flowers woven into the style, something Mary would never have done in life, as she preferred simpler arrangements. When I mentioned this to Mr. Hammond, he spoke of special preparations that could create such effects. I found comfort in her peaceful appearance at the time, not knowing the terrible truth behind it. The Collins funeral proceeded without incident, and Elizabeth Thorpe returned to Albany with nothing but a vague sense of discomfort regarding the undertaker's manner. Life in Millbrook continued undisturbed through the spring of 1915. The Hammond Funeral Home received the deceased, prepared them for viewing, and returned them to the earth or to their final resting places in the town's 2 cemeteries. No one questioned the procedures that took place behind the funeral home's heavy oak doors. In late March, an elderly resident named Harold Wilson passed away in his sleep at the age of 82. Wilson, a retired farmer who had lived alone since his wife's death a decade earlier, was found by a neighbor who delivered meals to him several times weekly. His funeral, handled by Hammond, was unremarkable, according to all accounts. The service, held at the Presbyterian church where Wilson had served as an elder, was attended primarily by other elderly residents who had known him throughout his long life. Hammond's private records, however, tell a different story. The entry for Wilson reads, "Subject unsuitable for extended preparation. Minimal work performed. Standard arrangements only. Inferior physical condition precludes. Interest beyond professional requirements." This pattern of Hammond categorizing the deceased as either suitable or unsuitable for what he termed extended preparation would become apparent to investigators only later, when his records were examined in full. The criteria for this categorization appeared to be based entirely on Hammond's personal aesthetic assessment of the bodies, rather than any professional or practical considerations. In April of that year, the body of Jonathan Mercer, a prominent local banker who had died of heart failure at 58, was prepared by Hammond. Mercer had served as president of the First National Bank of Millbrook for 15 years and was known throughout Dutchess County for his conservative financial policies, which had helped the bank weather economic downturns. His funeral was one of the largest Millbrook had seen in years, with mourners coming from as far as New York City to pay their respects. At the viewing, held in the largest room of the Hammond funeral home, Mercer's wife of 30 years, Carolyn, became distressed upon seeing her husband. According to a report filed with the Millbrook Police Department on April 22, 1915, Carolyn claimed that something wasn't right about her husband's appearance. The report quotes her as saying, "That is not how he looked. His hair is different. The expression is wrong. Jonathan never wore his hair parted that way, not once in our marriage. And there's something about his face. It's as if someone tried to make him smile. Jonathan was a serious man. He wouldn't want to be presented this way." The officer who took the statement, James Harkins, attributed her distress to grief and noted in his report that such reactions were not uncommon when confronted with the reality of a loved one's death. Mrs. Mercer became quite agitated, Harkins wrote. She insisted on speaking privately with Mr. Hammond, which she did for approximately 10 minutes in the consultation room. Upon emerging, she appeared calmer, though still visibly upset. No further action was taken at the time, as the matter seemed to involve only a disagreement about cosmetic details. What Carolyn Mercer noticed, but could not articulate fully, were subtle changes to her husband's appearance that went beyond standard funeral preparations. Jonathan Mercer's hair, which he had always parted on the left, had been arranged with a right side part. His expression, which Carolyn described as almost smiling, was unlike any she had seen on her husband's face in life. Most disturbing to her, though she did not include this in her formal complaint, was the faint scent of cologne that Jonathan had never worn. In her later statement to investigators, Carolyn revealed that during her private conversation with Hammond, he had dismissed her concerns with professional authority. "He told me that the embalming process often causes subtle changes in appearance," she recalled. He said that families frequently experience disorientation when viewing their loved ones after preparation and that this was a normal part of the grieving process. He spoke with such confidence, such professional certainty, that I began to doubt my own perceptions. After all, he was the expert in these matters, not I. Edward Hammond had reportedly assured Mrs. Mercer that everything had been done according to standard practice, that sometimes the embalming process could slightly alter appearance, and that she was simply experiencing the shock of loss. Carolyn Mercer, overwhelmed by grief and surrounded by well-meaning friends who encouraged her to rest, did not pursue her concerns. The banker was buried the following day in St. Peter Cemetery, with Hammond overseeing all arrangements. What no one knew at the time was that Hammond's mortuary logbook contained another unusual entry for Jonathan Mercer. Subject exhibits ideal preservation. 7 hours of arrangement necessary to achieve desired presentation. Unusual for male subject to require such attention, but features warranted the effort. Additional time spent in solitary observation to ensure quality. The entry concluded with a cryptic notation. Third successful case this month. Collection expanding satisfactorily. This reference to a collection would later prove significant to investigators. When Hammond's private quarters were searched in July 1915, they discovered not only the logbooks and photographs, but also a cabinet containing small boxes, each labeled with a name and date. These boxes contained what Hammond referred to in his journal as mementos, small items taken from the bodies in his care. From Jonathan Mercer, Hammond had taken a lock of hair, a shirt stud, and bizarrely, what appeared to be a fingernail preserved in a small vial. By summer 1915, a pattern had emerged, though it remained invisible to the residents of Millbrook. The Hammond Funeral Home handled approximately 20 deaths between January and June, a typical number for a town of that size. For each, Edward Hammond followed the same routine, receiving the body, preparing it in the basement workroom, allowing family visitation, and finalizing burial arrangements. For most cases, the preparation period was brief, a matter of hours. But for certain deceased individuals, primarily women between the ages of 20 and 40, Hammond's records indicated extended preparation times, often spanning multiple nights. Hammond's logbook entries for these cases followed a consistent pattern. Initial entries were professional and detached, noting the condition of the body upon receipt, any challenges presented by the cause of death, and the standard preparations undertaken. Subsequent entries, however, shifted in tone, becoming more personal and frequently inappropriate. Hammond would document his visits to the deceased during overnight hours, describing in disturbing detail his interactions with the bodies and his emotional or aesthetic responses to them. For some cases, Hammond created separate journal entries in a personal diary kept locked in his bedroom. These entries, later described by investigators as deeply disturbing, revealed the full extent of his deviant behavior. The diary, bound in black leather with no identifying marks on its cover, contained entries dating back to 1909, suggesting that Hammond's activities had begun shortly after he took over the business following his father's death. The earliest entries described only unusual interest in and attention to certain bodies. But over time, the accounts became more explicit, documenting increasingly inappropriate interactions with the deceased. During this period, Hammond maintained his public persona as a respected, if somewhat reserved, professional. He attended Sunday services at St. Peter's Episcopal Church, though he rarely remained for the social gatherings afterward. He was occasionally seen dining alone at the Millbrook Inn, where servers noted his precise habits and minimal conversation. According to town records, he served on the Millbrook Business Association, though minutes from meetings indicate he rarely spoke, except on matters directly related to his establishment. Hammond's daily routine, as reconstructed by investigators from witness statements, was methodical and predictable. He rose early, typically before 6 a.m., and spent approximately 1 hour in his private quarters before descending to the basement to check on any bodies currently in his care. After breakfast at the Millbrook Inn, he would return to the funeral home to handle administrative matters, meet with bereaved families, or oversee funeral proceedings. Afternoons were dedicated to preparation work when new cases arrived or to maintenance of the facilities when no active cases required attention. Evenings often found him in his study, maintaining his business and personal records. What no one knew was that Hammond frequently returned to the basement late at night, spending hours alone with the bodies he found most interesting. The funeral home stood separate from other buildings on Franklin Avenue, with Hammond's living quarters on the second floor above the viewing rooms. This isolation afforded Hammond privacy that would prove essential to concealing his activities. The basement, where bodies were prepared, had small windows at ground level, which Hammond had covered with heavy curtains shortly after taking over the business from his father in 1908. According to property records filed with Dutchess County, he had also commissioned significant renovations to the basement area in 1910, including the installation of additional sinks, drainage systems, and specialized lighting. The contractor who performed the work, Thomas Waldron, later stated that Hammond had been unusually specific about the renovations, insisting on privacy and refusing to allow workers access to certain areas once basic construction was complete. He was particular about everything, Waldron recalled in his statement to police. The lighting had to be positioned just so, with multiple angles possible. He requested special mirrors that could be adjusted and moved around the room. I assumed these were for the preparation process to ensure the deceased looked proper from all angles. Waldron's testimony, given to police in July 1915, included the observation that Hammond had requested unusually complex locks for certain doors within the basement area, locks that seemed excessive for a funeral home in a small town where crime was rare. He said it was to protect the specialized equipment and chemicals used in his work, Waldron recalled. I thought nothing of it at the time, though looking back, his insistence on personally overseeing the installation of those locks seems significant. Most troubling in retrospect, Waldron noted, was Hammond's request for a separate room accessible only through the main preparation area, with no external entrance or windows. He called it his special projects room and said it was for experimental preservation techniques, Waldron stated. He was quite excited about it, more animated than I'd ever seen him. Said it would allow him to advance his professional methods beyond what his father had practiced. At the time, it seemed like admirable professional dedication. In late June 1915, Sarah Peterson, the 19-year-old daughter of the local school teacher, drowned in a tragic accident at Cotter's Creek, approximately 2 miles outside of Millbrook. Sarah had been swimming with friends when she apparently suffered a cramp and slipped beneath the water. Despite efforts to rescue her, she was underwater for several minutes before being pulled to shore. Attempts to revive her proved unsuccessful. Her body was recovered after several hours and brought to Hammond's funeral home, as was standard practice for accidental deaths in the area. Sarah's father, William Peterson, who had taught at the Millbrook School for over 20 years, was well respected in the community. A widower, his wife having died during childbirth, Peterson had raised Sarah alone, and the two were known to be exceptionally close. The community's sympathy for Peterson was evident in the outpouring of support following Sarah's death, with neighbors providing meals, handling funeral arrangements, and offering whatever comfort they could to the bereaved father. William Peterson requested a delayed funeral to allow relatives from Massachusetts to attend. As a result, Sarah's body remained in Hammond's care for nearly 5 days, an unusually long period but not unprecedented given the circumstances. During this time, Peterson visited the funeral home daily, spending hours sitting with his daughter's body and receiving visitors who came to offer condolences. According to the statement William Peterson would later give to authorities, he had returned to the funeral home unexpectedly on the second evening to deliver a photograph of Sarah for the memorial display. It was approximately 9:30 p.m. His statement reads, "I had found a particular photograph that I thought would be appropriate for the funeral. Sarah at her high school graduation the previous year. I knew the funeral home would be closed, but I had observed lights on in the building as I walked past and thought perhaps Mr. Hammond was working late and might accept the photograph for use in the memorial service." Peterson's statement continues, "I knocked at the front door but received no answer, though lights were visible in the basement windows. Thinking Mr. Hammond might be working and unable to hear, I tried the door and found it unlocked. I called out upon entering but received no response. I considered leaving the photograph on the desk in the consultation room with a note, but then thought perhaps Mr. Hammond was in the basement preparing my daughter for the funeral." What William Peterson discovered upon entering the funeral home would unravel the carefully constructed facade Edward Hammond had maintained for years. Peterson described hearing strange sounds coming from the basement, not machinery, but something like humming or low talking. Concerned, he descended the stairs quietly, worried that something might be wrong or that an unauthorized person might have entered the funeral home. He found the basement door ajar and, through the narrow opening, observed a scene that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. The police report filed on June 29, 1915, contains Peterson's account of what he witnessed, though portions were later redacted from public records. According to the unredacted sections, Peterson observed Hammond alone with his daughter's body, which had been arranged on a preparation table. Hammond was not performing any professional duties, but rather was seated beside the body in what Peterson described as a manner suggesting intimacy rather than professional attention. Hammond was allegedly speaking to the deceased as if she were alive, stroking her hair and face. What the redacted portions of the report contained, according to notes made by researchers who later gained access to the sealed records, were descriptions of Hammond engaged in behaviors far more disturbing than merely speaking to the deceased. These details, deemed too graphic for public record, even by the standards of early 20th century law enforcement, suggested a level of physical interaction with the deceased that violated both professional ethics and criminal statutes. Peterson's immediate reaction was one of shock and horror. By his own account, he called out, causing Hammond to look up with an expression of neither shame nor surprise, but rather irritation at being interrupted. Peterson fled the funeral home and went directly to the home of Millbrook Police Chief Thomas Donnelly, who resided 3 blocks away. Chief Donnelly, according to his own report, initially questioned Peterson's account, suggesting that the school teacher might have misinterpreted what he saw due to grief and the dim lighting of the basement. Mr. Peterson was in a highly agitated state, Donnelly wrote. His description of events seemed influenced by the extreme distress any father would feel in similar circumstances. Nevertheless, Donnelly agreed to accompany Peterson back to the funeral home to investigate. Chief Donnelly, accompanied by Officer James Harkins, returned to the funeral home within 30 minutes. They found Hammond in the main viewing room, calmly arranging flowers. When confronted with Peterson's account, Hammond denied any impropriety, claiming he had been making final adjustments to ensure the young lady looked her best for her grieving family. He suggested that Peterson, overwhelmed by grief, had misinterpreted a routine professional procedure. Hammond's demeanor during this confrontation, as described by both Donnelly and Harkins in their reports, was remarkably composed. He showed neither the defensiveness of guilt nor the indignation of innocence, Harkins noted. Rather, he responded with a professional calm that made Peterson's accusations seem almost hysterical by comparison. This composure, which initially worked in Hammond's favor, would later be interpreted by investigators as evidence of his disturbing detachment and ability to compartmentalize his deviant behavior. Uncertain of how to proceed, but disturbed by Peterson's distress, Chief Donnelly made the decision to remove Sarah Peterson's body from Hammond's care. It was transferred to a funeral home in the neighboring town of Pleasant Valley, where another undertaker, Morris Whitfield, took over the preparations. Whitfield noted no obvious signs of interference or mistreatment. However, this undertaker did note in his records that the deceased appears to have been subjected to unusual cosmetic attention, with makeup applied more extensively than is standard practice. Whitfield elaborated in his statement to authorities. The young lady's hair had been arranged in an elaborate style more suited to a bride than a deceased teenager. Her face had been painted with cosmetics in a manner I found inappropriate for someone of her age and circumstances. Most concerning, there were what appeared to be fresh bruises on her wrists and ankles, which I documented photographically before completing her preparation for burial. The incident might have ended there, attributed to a grieving father's misperception, had it not been for Grace Miller, who had worked as a cleaning woman at the Hammond Funeral Home for 11 years. Upon hearing rumors of the disturbance involving the Peterson girl, Miller approached Chief Donnelly with concerns she had harbored for some time, but had dismissed as improper to mention. Miller, a widow in her 60s, had maintained a professional relationship with Hammond throughout her employment. She arrived early each morning before viewings were scheduled to clean the public areas of the funeral home. She was not permitted to enter the basement preparation area except on specified days when no bodies were present, and never entered Hammond's private quarters except for weekly cleaning. Despite these limitations, her work had provided her with opportunities to observe patterns and anomalies that, in retrospect, should have raised concerns much earlier. According to police records, Miller reported finding unusual items in the waste bins on multiple occasions, excessive amounts of makeup, personal grooming implements not typically used in funeral preparations, and, most disturbingly, what appeared to be locks of hair carefully tied with ribbon. She had also noticed that certain garments stored for use on the deceased would occasionally be found in Hammond's private quarters. Miller admitted she had not immediately reported these findings because she feared losing her position and because Mr. Hammond had always been correct in his behavior toward the living. Miller's statement also included observations about Hammond's personal habits that, while not directly incriminating, contributed to the emerging profile of a deeply disturbed individual. She noted that Hammond often worked through the night when certain bodies were in his care, that he maintained an extensive collection of photographs of the deceased arranged in albums in his office, and that he sometimes spoke of particular cases in terms that struck her as overly personal. He would refer to some of the deceased, particularly younger women, by their first names, as if he knew them intimately, Miller stated. This always seemed inappropriate to me, but I attributed it to the unusual nature of his profession. Miller also reported discovering a hidden compartment in Hammond's desk in the consultation room. I was cleaning the desk one morning in early June, her statement reads, when I accidentally pressed something that caused a small drawer to pop open from beneath the main drawer. Inside were several small objects that seemed out of place, a woman's hairpin, a man's cufflink, what looked like a child's tooth. I closed the drawer immediately and never mentioned it to Mr. Hammond, but the incident troubled me deeply. Chief Donnelly, now deeply concerned, obtained a warrant to search the premises of the Hammond Funeral Home on July 9, 1915. The search, conducted by Donnelly, Harkins, and 2 additional officers from the County Sheriff's Department, was thorough and methodical. It began in the public areas of the funeral home, where nothing unusual was discovered, before proceeding to Hammond's private quarters and finally to the basement preparation area. What investigators discovered in Hammond's private quarters and in a hidden room accessed through a concealed door in the basement preparation area would shock the community and become the basis for one of the most disturbing cases in Dutchess County history. The search revealed a carefully cataloged collection of items taken from the deceased: locks of hair, personal effects, and a journal containing detailed observations of numerous bodies that had passed through the funeral home. The journal, excerpts of which were included in the police file but later sealed by court order, reportedly contained explicit descriptions of Hammond's activities with the deceased under his care. These descriptions suggested a years-long pattern of interference with bodies, primarily those of young women, but occasionally men whom Hammond found aesthetically noteworthy. The hidden room, accessible through what appeared to be a storage cabinet in the main preparation area, measured approximately 10 feet by 12 feet. It had been constructed during the 1910 renovations and was not included in any official building plans. The room contained a second preparation table, specialized lighting fixtures, a camera mounted on a tripod, and various implements that investigators initially assumed were related to the embalming process, but later determined had no legitimate professional purpose. Most disturbing were the photographs discovered in a locked cabinet in Hammond's bedroom. These images, taken in the basement preparation room, documented Hammond's interactions with the deceased in various stages of preparation. The photographs were meticulously organized, labeled with names and dates, and annotated with personal comments. According to police records, the collection dated back to 1909, suggesting that Hammond's activities had been ongoing for at least 6 years. The photographs, described in police reports as unsuitable for public documentation, depicted Hammond posing with the deceased in ways that ranged from simply inappropriate to explicitly violating. In some images, Hammond had arranged bodies in lifelike poses, seated at tables or reclined on sofas that were not part of the funeral home's public areas. In others, he had documented himself engaged in acts that, even by the standards of 1915, were recognized as profoundly disturbed and criminal. In addition to the photographs, investigators discovered an extensive collection of personal items taken from the deceased: jewelry, locks of hair, articles of clothing, and, in some cases, more intimate items. These were stored in boxes labeled with names and dates, suggesting that Hammond viewed these items as mementos or keepsakes rather than evidence to be concealed. This systematic cataloging, along with his detailed journal entries, indicated a disturbing lack of awareness or concern about the criminal nature of his actions. The search also revealed a collection of medical and anatomical textbooks, many with passages highlighted and annotated in Hammond's handwriting. These annotations, according to investigators, suggested an obsessive interest in the preservation and aesthetic presentation of the human body that went far beyond professional requirements. One book, a medical text on anatomy, contained extensive notes in the margins beside illustrations of female subjects, with Hammond commenting on techniques for preserving and enhancing specific features after death. Edward Hammond was arrested on July 2, 1915, and charged with multiple counts of interfering with a corpse, a crime that, while serious, seemed inadequate to encompass the nature and extent of his violations. News of the arrest spread quickly through Millbrook and surrounding communities. The Poughkeepsie Eagle News ran a front-page story on July 3rd with the headline, "Funeral Director Arrested for Shocking Misconduct," though the paper refrained from publishing specific details out of respect for the families involved and in accordance with the standards of the time. The news article read, in part, "Edward Hammond, proprietor of the Hammond Funeral Home in Millbrook, was arrested yesterday on charges related to improper conduct in the exercise of his professional duties. Authorities have released few details, citing the sensitive nature of the case and respect for the families involved." Chief Thomas Donnelly of the Millbrook Police Department confirmed that the arrest followed an investigation into complaints regarding Mr. Hammond's treatment of the deceased in his care. Mr. Hammond is currently held in the Dutchess County Jail, awaiting arraignment. Local reaction to Hammond's arrest was complex and multifaceted. Initial disbelief gave way to horror as limited information about the case began to circulate. Many residents struggled to reconcile the reserved, professional Hammond they had known with the disturbed individual described in whispered conversations. Some expressed guilt for not having recognized signs of his deviance, while others insisted that no such signs had been apparent, that Hammond had maintained his facade of normalcy with remarkable skill. For families who had entrusted their deceased loved ones to Hammond's care, the revelation brought a unique form of trauma. They faced not only the horror of what might have happened to their loved ones after death, but also the impossible decision of whether to seek confirmation through exhumation or to leave the matter unresolved. Most chose the latter, preferring uncertainty to potentially devastating confirmation. The reaction in Millbrook was one of collective horror and disbelief. Families who had entrusted their loved ones to Hammond's care now faced the terrible uncertainty of what might have happened to those bodies before burial. The police were inundated with inquiries but could provide few answers. In many cases, exhumation would have been the only way to determine if a body had been interfered with, and few families were willing to subject themselves to that additional trauma. The local clergy attempted to provide comfort and guidance to their congregations during this difficult time. Reverend Thomas Whitley of St. Peter's Episcopal Church, where Hammond had been a member, addressed the case directly in his sermon the Sunday following the arrest. According to church records, Whitley spoke of the darkness that can exist within any human heart, and of the importance of supporting those affected by Hammond's crimes. He avoided specific details but acknowledged the community's collective shock and grief. "We gather today in the shadow of a revelation that has shaken our community to its core," Whitley began, according to the church's records of his sermon. "We find ourselves confronting a betrayal of trust so profound that it challenges our understanding of human nature. In such moments, we must turn to one another for comfort and to our faith for guidance. Let us remember that the acts of one individual do not define our community, and that in responding to this darkness with compassion for those affected, we affirm the goodness that still prevails among us." Father Michael Donovan of St. Joseph's Catholic Church adopted a different approach, focusing on the sanctity of burial rites and the Church's teachings regarding respect for the deceased. His sermon, delivered to a packed congregation, emphasized that the violations committed against the dead affected not only the deceased themselves, but also the living who mourned them. He announced that the Church would offer special prayers for all those who had been buried through the Hammond Funeral Home, a gesture intended to provide spiritual comfort to affected families. Hammond offered no defense for his actions when questioned by authorities. According to police records, he appeared calm and spoke of his activities with a disturbing detachment, as if discussing ordinary business practices. He expressed surprise not at being arrested, but at the reaction to what he termed his appreciation of beauty preserved beyond life. When asked how long he had engaged in such behavior, Hammond reportedly stated that he had always felt a connection to those between worlds, but had only begun to act upon these feelings after his father's death in 908. During his brief incarceration, Hammond maintained this eerie composure. Jail records indicate that he spoke little to other inmates or guards, spending most of his time writing in a notebook provided by his attorney. The contents of these writings, if they still exist, remain sealed along with other case materials. The attending physician noted that Hammond showed no signs of recognized mental illness as understood at the time, no hallucinations, delusions, or irrational behavior. He was, by all clinical standards of 1915, sane, a fact that made his behavior all the more disturbing to those attempting to understand it. Hammond's attorney, Richard Blackwell of Poughkeepsie, visited his client several times during his incarceration. Blackwell, a respected lawyer known for handling complex criminal cases throughout Dutchess County, made no public statements regarding the case. His private notes, discovered among his papers after his death in 1932 and later donated to the Dutchess County Historical Society, reveal his own struggle to comprehend his client's actions and to formulate an appropriate defense. "Hammond presents a unique challenge," Blackwell wrote after their first meeting. "He neither denies his actions nor expresses remorse for them. Rather, he speaks of his work with the deceased as if it were a form of art or service. He seems genuinely perplexed by the reaction of authorities and the community, as if he expected his activities, once discovered, to be recognized as valuable rather than criminal. I find myself at a loss as to how to proceed with his defense, as he rejects any suggestion that his behavior was inappropriate, let alone illegal. The case never went to trial." On July 15, 1915, while awaiting court proceedings in the Dutchess County Jail, Edward Hammond was found dead in his cell. The coroner's report listed the cause as suicide by ingestion of embalming fluid, which Hammond had apparently smuggled into the jail, concealed in a toiletry bottle. A subsequent investigation into how Hammond had obtained the toxic substance revealed that his attorney had unknowingly delivered it. Having been given a sealed package by Hammond's cousin from Boston, who claimed it contained personal items that Hammond had requested. This cousin, Robert Hammond, was interviewed by authorities following Edward's death. He claimed to have received the package by mail, with instructions to deliver it to Blackwell for transfer to Edward. Robert maintained that he had no knowledge of the package's contents and had no reason to suspect anything improper, as he had not seen his cousin in over 5 years and knew nothing of the charges against him until after delivering the package. No charges were filed against either Robert Hammond or attorney Blackwell, as investigators were satisfied that neither had knowingly participated in providing the means for Hammond's suicide. Hammond's final statement, written on paper provided for correspondence with legal counsel, contained no apology or explanation, but rather a complaint that his work had been misunderstood and that he had provided a service to both the deceased and their families by preserving beauty that would otherwise be lost to decay. The note, which spans 3 pages, reveals Hammond's disturbed perspective on his actions. "I have done nothing but honor those who have passed," he wrote. "I have preserved them, appreciated them, kept them company when all others had abandoned them to the earth. Is this not a greater service than the hasty, impersonal preparation most undertakers provide?" This passage, quoted in the coroner's report but omitted from newspaper accounts, offers a glimpse into Hammond's profound detachment from normal ethical and moral boundaries. The final paragraph of Hammond's suicide note has been interpreted by researchers as revealing a deep-seated pathology that had likely been present throughout his adult life. "Those who judge me understand neither death nor beauty," he wrote. "In my care, the deceased achieved a perfection denied them in life. They became art, preserved in moments of ideal form, appreciated as they deserved to be. What I have done is not a crime but a devotion, not a violation but a consecration. If society cannot understand this, then I choose to join those I have honored in the realm where such understanding is unnecessary." Hammond's suicide brought an abrupt end to any possibility of a complete investigation or prosecution. Questions about how many deceased had been violated, about whether Hammond had ever been caught or suspected before, and about whether he had engaged in similar behavior in other locations would remain largely unanswered. The community, denied the catharsis of a trial and formal judgment, was left to process the case without closure. Following Hammond's death, authorities faced the delicate task of notifying families whose deceased loved ones appeared in Hammond's records or photographs. This process was handled with extreme discretion, with many details withheld to spare families unnecessary distress. According to county records, approximately 30 families were contacted directly regarding evidence that their deceased relatives had been among Hammond's victims. The actual number of cases was likely higher, as investigators decided not to contact families where the evidence was less conclusive or where the violations appeared to have been less severe. The decision was made at the county level to seal most records related to the case, accessible only to law enforcement and by court order. This decision, while intended to protect the dignity of the deceased and the feelings of their families, had the unintended consequence of allowing the details of the case to be gradually forgotten or distorted over time. Without accessible records, the Hammond case would eventually become more rumor than documented history in Millbrook's collective memory. The Hammond funeral home was permanently closed. The building remained vacant for several years, becoming the subject of local whispered stories before being purchased in 1920 by a hardware merchant who had it demolished and replaced with a new structure. No trace of the original building exists today. The impact of the Hammond case extended beyond Millbrook. News of the case, though reported with limited details, reached funeral directors and regulatory bodies throughout the Northeast. According to records from the New York State Funeral Directors Association, the case contributed to discussions about increased oversight and standardization of funeral practices. While formal regulations would not be implemented for several more years, the Hammond case became a cautionary example cited in professional circles. In a 1917 address to the National Funeral Directors Association, recorded in the organization's journal, the president of the association made indirect reference to the case. "Recent events in our profession have highlighted the sacred trust placed in our hands by grieving families. It is incumbent upon us to ensure that this trust is never violated, that the dignity of the deceased is preserved, not merely through technical skill but through the highest ethical standards. To this end, I propose the formation of a committee to draft comprehensive guidelines for our profession, addressing not only the scientific aspects of our work, but also the moral obligations inherent in our calling. The case might have faded entirely from public memory had it not been for Dr. Martin Schreiber, a criminologist from Columbia University, who in 1962 obtained permission to review the sealed records as part of a study on historical criminal psychology. Schreiber's research notes, found among his papers after his death in 1968, contain references to the Hammond case as a remarkable example of necrophilic behavior manifesting within a socially sanctioned role that provided both access and cover for deviant activities. Schreiber's analysis of the case, while never formally published, provides one of the few professional assessments of Hammond's psychology. According to Schreiber's notes, Hammond exhibited classic traits of necrophilia, a paraphilia characterized by sexual attraction to corpses, but with unusual characteristics that distinguished his case from others documented in the literature. Specifically, Hammond's methodical documentation, his apparent belief in the propriety of his actions, and his integration of his deviant behavior into a legitimate professional role marked his case as unique among those Schreiber had studied. Hammond represents an unusual subcategory of necrophilic behavior, Schreiber wrote. Unlike most documented cases, which involve opportunistic access to corpses or disinterment of the dead, Hammond established a professional framework that provided legitimate access to the deceased. More significantly, he appears to have rationalized his behavior not as a deviation, but as an enhancement of his professional role, a perspective that allowed him to maintain both his public persona and his private activities without the cognitive dissonance one might expect. Schreiber noted that Hammond's journals revealed a progressive escalation in his behavior over time. Early entries suggested an inappropriate but limited interest in the deceased, primarily aesthetic in nature. As the years passed, this interest became more intrusive and eventually explicitly violating. This pattern of escalation, Schreiber observed, was consistent with other paraphilic disorders, where boundaries are gradually pushed as earlier activities cease to provide the same psychological or emotional satisfaction. Schreiber never published his findings on the Hammond case, reportedly deciding that, even decades later, the details remained too disturbing for academic publication. His notes indicate that Hammond's journal contained passages suggesting he viewed himself as preserving beauty beyond its natural term and forming relationships uncomplicated by the demands of living participants. Schreiber's analysis suggested that Hammond selected his victims based on physical attributes he found appealing and that he viewed his professional role not as a service to the community but as providing him with subjects for appreciation. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case from a psychological perspective was Hammond's apparent lack of awareness that his behavior was wrong. Unlike many criminals who take steps to conceal their actions out of a recognition of their illegality or social unacceptability, Hammond documented his activities extensively, kept trophies openly in his home, and, when confronted, expressed confusion at others' reactions. This suggests a profound disconnect from societal norms and ethical boundaries, a disconnect that allowed him to maintain his public persona while engaging in deeply disturbed private behavior, while emphasizing that no definitive explanation was possible. Given the limited information available, Schreiber suggested several factors that might have contributed to Hammond's pathology. His abandoned medical studies, which might have indicated an early fascination with the human body, his apparent social isolation with no documented close relationships, and his sudden inheritance of the funeral business following his father's death, which provided both opportunity and a framework for his deviance to manifest. Schreiber's notes also explore the possible origins of Hammond's deviant behavior. What the Hammond case does offer, if anything, is a reminder of the importance of transparency, oversight, and accountability in all professions that involve vulnerable individuals, whether living or deceased. It serves as a historical footnote that helps shape modern funeral practices, contributing to changes that now make similar cases far less likely to occur or to continue undetected. In the end, the story of Edward Hammond is not one of supernatural horror or extraordinary evil, but rather of ordinary deviance concealed behind a respected professional role, a betrayal of trust made possible by privacy, authority, and the reluctance of a community to imagine that such violations could occur in their midst. It is a case that reminds us that sometimes the most troubling dangers are not those that announce themselves with violence or spectacle, but those that operate quietly behind closed doors, exploiting the trust we place in those who serve essential social functions. And so, the Hammond case remains documented but largely unexamined, remembered but rarely discussed, a dark chapter in local history that few care to revisit. The residents of modern Millbrook go about their lives, largely unaware of what once occurred in their community, the sealed records in the county archives ensuring that the most disturbing details remain confined to the past. And across Dutchess County, in cemeteries where Hammond's victims now rest, nothing disturbs their peace, their final dignity restored by time, silence, and the merciful fading of memory.